This wasn't supposed to happen like this. Not this fast. Not this loud. And definitely not on this stage. Because just a year ago, Caitlin Clark was still being framed as a college phenomenon. A once-in-a-generation scorer. A player who changed the women's game. That was the box. That was the ceiling people were comfortable with. And for a while, it looked like that's where the conversation would stay. But then something shifted. Quietly at first. Almost invisibly. Until suddenly, the biggest basketball league in the world made a move that forced everyone to stop pretending. NBC didn't just invite Caitlin Clark onto an NBA broadcast. They didn't hand her a quick cameo. They didn't tuck her into a side segment or a novelty role. They placed her front and center. And when that announcement dropped, it sent shock waves through the basketball world. Not because Caitlin Clark isn't qualified, but because of what it implies. Because moves like this don't happen by accident. They don't happen out of generosity. And they definitely don't happen unless powerful people believe something much bigger is unfolding. This wasn't about representation. This wasn't about a feel-good moment. This was a calculated decision by a network about to spend billions, and needing a face they could trust to carry the future of basketball coverage. And the wildest part? They didn't choose an NBA superstar. They didn't choose a retired legend. They didn't choose a safe, familiar voice. They chose a 22-year-old WNBA rookie. Which raises a dangerous question no one wants to say out loud yet. What does the NBA see in Caitlin Clark that everyone else is still catching up to? Because once you understand why NBC made this call, the story stops being about basketball analysis and starts looking a lot more like a power shift. And that realization begins with the one thing NBC couldn't afford to mess up: their NBA relaunch. When NBC decided to bring the NBA back home, they weren't just buying broadcasting rights. They were buying risk. Massive risk. This wasn't a casual return to basketball coverage. This was NBC stepping back into one of the most competitive, expensive, and unforgiving media arenas in sports. NBA rights cost billions. Expectations are brutal. And failure isn't measured quietly. It's measured in ratings, headlines, and public embarrassment. NBC already had the nostalgia. They had the iconic theme music. They had the memories of Jordan, Showtime, and an era fans still romanticize. But nostalgia alone doesn't win 2025. The modern sports audience doesn't just want games. They want connection. They want personalities. They want moments that feel culturally relevant, shareable, and alive beyond the final buzzer. And NBC knew something uncomfortable that other networks still pretend isn't true. The traditional NBA broadcast model is aging out. Same voices. Same takes. Same recycled arguments dressed up as analysis. That formula doesn't hook Gen Z. It doesn't dominate TikTok. It doesn't create viral moments outside hardcore fans. And NBC wasn't about to spend billions just to sound like everyone else. They needed a disruptor. Someone who could instantly pull in a younger audience without alienating older fans. Someone who felt modern without feeling manufactured. Someone who didn't need to be introduced to casual viewers because her name already carried weight far beyond the box score. And that's where Caitlin Clark becomes unavoidable. Because unlike almost any athlete in America right now, Caitlin doesn't just attract fans, she activates them. She moves them to click, to subscribe, to argue, to watch entire broadcasts they otherwise wouldn't care about. NBC already tested this. When her college games were placed behind a paywall, people didn't complain and move on. They pulled out their wallets. They signed up. They proved in real time that Caitlin Clark wasn't just popular, she was monetizable. That's the word executives care about. Not hype, not buzz, not headlines. Conversion. NBC didn't look at Caitlin Clark and see a WNBA player. They saw a ratings engine, a cultural bridge, a once-in-a-decade opportunity to link the old basketball audience with the new one using a single face that both sides already respected. And here's the part that makes this move so revealing. If this were just about basketball knowledge, NBC had endless options. Retired stars, veteran analysts, safe voices who've been in studios for decades. But they didn't want safe. They wanted impact. They wanted someone who feels inevitable. Someone whose presence alone creates conversation before a word is even spoken. Someone who can sit next to Hall of Famers and not feel out of place, not because of resume, but because of gravity. By choosing Caitlin Clark to help launch their NBA coverage, NBC made a statement without saying it directly. They're betting that the future of basketball fandom doesn't revolve around tradition anymore. It revolves around who people care about, and whether anyone in the NBA media ecosystem likes it or not. Caitlin Clark is already one of the most cared about figures in the sport. But the gamble didn't stop with who they chose. It gets even louder when you look at where they chose to debut her. Because the stage they picked wasn't symbolic. It was intentional. And that's where this story really starts to get uncomfortable. If NBC wanted to play it safe, they had dozens of safer options. They could have debuted Caitlin Clark on a low-stakes game, a regional matchup, a quiet Sunday where the spotlight wouldn't burn too hot. They could have eased her in, tested audience reaction, and slowly built towards something bigger. They did the exact opposite. NBC dropped her into Madison Square Garden. Lakers versus Knicks. National television. The most mythologized arena in basketball history. That alone tells you everything. Madison Square Garden isn't just a venue. It's a test. It's where stars are validated or exposed. It's where reputations either expand or crack under pressure. The Garden doesn't care about hype. It doesn't care about potential. It only respects confidence, command, and presence. And NBC chose that stage for Caitlin Clark's NBA debut. Not because it looks good on a press release, but because if she belongs anywhere, she belongs there. Think about the symbolism for a second. LeBron James on the floor. New York media circling. The loudest, most unforgiving basketball audience in the country watching closely. And then Caitlin Clark walks onto the set. Not to cheer, not to observe, not to smile politely, but to analyze the NBA. That's not accidental placement. That's a statement. NBC wasn't just introducing her to NBA fans. They were introducing NBA fans to a new authority, a new voice, a new lens through which the game could be understood. And here's where it gets even more revealing. NBC didn't put her on during halftime or tuck her into a post-game segment when casual viewers have already checked out. They placed her before tip-off, when attention is highest and expectations are sharpest. Pre-game coverage is where narratives are set, where tone is established, where the audience decides whether they're locked in or multitasking. That's sacred ground in sports television, and NBC handed it to Caitlin Clark. That move alone says they weren't worried about backlash. They weren't worried about critics questioning her experience. They weren't worried about traditionalists pushing back. Because NBC already knew something those critics haven't fully processed yet. Caitlin Clark doesn't need permission to be taken seriously. Her presence commands it, and the Garden amplifies that reality. Everything there is louder. Every mistake is magnified. Every success echoes longer. If she were to stumble, it would be impossible to hide. If she were to shine, it would feel historic. NBC didn't shield her from that pressure. They embraced it, because pressure reveals truth. And the truth NBC is betting on is that Caitlin Clark doesn't just survive in the NBA spotlight, she thrives in it. But the real tension isn't about the building. It's about who she'll be sitting next to. Because once she takes that seat beside some of the greatest scorers in NBA history, the conversation changes. It stops being theoretical. It stops being symbolic. It becomes very real, very fast. And that's where the hierarchy of basketball media starts to feel unstable. Because next to her won't be rookies. Won't be influencers. Won't be filler analysts. She'll be shoulder to shoulder with legends. And that dynamic, that's where this entire experiment could either redefine the game or expose how unprepared people are for what's already happening. And once you see who's sharing that desk with her, it becomes impossible to ignore what NBC is really doing. This is the moment where the story stops feeling symbolic and starts feeling disruptive. Because once Caitlin Clark takes her seat on that NBA set, she isn't just joining a broadcast. She's stepping into a space that has been guarded for decades. A space traditionally reserved for men who've already written their names into basketball history with championships, scoring titles, and Hall of Fame speeches. And NBC didn't pair her with just anyone. They sat her next to Carmelo Anthony, Vince Carter, Tracy McGrady, three of the most respected offensive players the NBA has ever produced. These aren't loud hot-take artists. These aren't studio lifers who talk more than they played. These are players whose careers are still studied, still debated, still referenced whenever scoring greatness comes up. Which is exactly why this pairing matters so much. Because NBC isn't framing Caitlin Clark as someone who needs to be taught the game. They're framing her as someone who belongs in the conversation. Think about how rare that is. Networks usually separate generations. Legends talk to legends. Young players appear briefly, smile, agree, and defer. Respect flows one direction. But this setup breaks that formula completely. Caitlin Clark isn't there to listen quietly. She's there to analyze, to challenge, to question, and to offer her own perspective on the NBA, next to players who once defined it. And the tension that creates is impossible to fake. Not because anyone doubts her knowledge, but because the image itself forces viewers to confront something they haven't fully accepted yet. That basketball intelligence isn't exclusive to one league. That understanding the game doesn't require NBA minutes. That insight can come from someone who's redefining the sport in real time. When fans see Caitlin Clark sitting shoulder to shoulder with these legends, something subtle but powerful happens. She stops being the best women's player. She becomes one of the smartest basketball minds in the room. That shift matters, because perception is everything in sports media. For years, the women's game has been framed as adjacent, separate, parallel but not equal, respectful but limited. And whether people admit it or not, that framing has shaped how fans listen. NBC just disrupted that narrative with one camera angle. The image of Caitlin Clark confidently breaking down spacing, shot selection, and defensive reads next to Carmelo Anthony sends a message no press release ever could. It says, she's not here to be impressive for her age or her league. She's here because she sees the game. And that realization doesn't just elevate Caitlin. It forces a recalibration across the entire basketball ecosystem. Because once NBA fans accept her analysis, even subconsciously, it becomes impossible to dismiss her play. The mental barrier between leagues starts to crack. Respect flows in directions it never did before. And NBC knows this. They didn't accidentally place her between legends. They didn't randomly choose scorers. They selected players whose games mirror hers in key ways. Melo's mid-range mastery, T-Mac's creativity and vision, Vince's explosiveness and evolution. Each one represents a different era of offensive dominance. And Caitlin Clark? She represents the next one, deep range, pace, spacing, and decision-making at warp speed. The conversations that will unfold on that desk won't just be entertaining. They'll be instructive. Fans will see a shared language, a shared obsession with angles, timing, and rhythm. And once that happens, the idea that Caitlin Clark doesn't belong in NBA conversations starts to feel outdated. But here's the part that really unsettles traditional media voices. Once viewers accept her as a peer to these legends, the hierarchy changes. Suddenly, the question isn't whether Caitlin Clark belongs on the desk. It's whether some of the usual voices still do. Because she brings something they don't. Fresh perspective. Modern shot selection logic. A style that mirrors the current NBA, not the past. And that threatens the comfort of repetition that's dominated basketball broadcasts for years. This isn't just about who's on camera. It's about who controls the narrative. And Caitlin Clark's presence quietly signals that the future of basketball conversation may not look like the past at all. But NBC didn't make this move just for symbolism or social impact. They made it because Caitlin Clark moves numbers. And once you understand the data behind this decision, the emotional debate fades, and the business reality takes over. Because what NBC is really chasing isn't approval. It's attention. And Caitlin Clark delivers it at a level few athletes can touch. At some point, every emotional argument disappears. The debate's about fairness. The conversation's about tradition. The noise from critics who say it's too much, too fast. None of that matters once the numbers come in. And NBC isn't guessing with Caitlin Clark. They already ran the experiment. During her college run, something unprecedented happened. NBC placed one of Caitlin Clark's record-breaking games behind a paywall. No free access. No casual channel flipping. If fans wanted to watch, they had to commit. And they did. In massive numbers. Subscriptions spiked. Engagement soared. People who had never paid for a streaming sports product before suddenly found a reason. That single decision gave NBC something more valuable than praise or controversy. Proof. Proof that Caitlin Clark doesn't just attract attention. She converts it. Proof that her audience isn't passive. They don't just scroll past highlights. They show up. They stay. They spend. That's the dream for any network. Because modern sports broadcasting is brutal. Viewers are fragmented. Attention spans are short. Loyalty is fragile. Networks aren't competing with each other anymore. They're competing with everything on the internet. And Caitlin Clark cuts through that chaos. Her games don't just trend, they dominate conversation. Her highlights don't fade after a night, they circulate for days. Her name alone sparks debates that stretch far beyond basketball. NBC executives don't see that as hype. They see it as leverage. When they looked at their NBA relaunch, they didn't ask, who's the most famous player? They asked, who can bring people with them? And the answer wasn't a 15-year veteran with an established fan base that's already locked into another network. It was Caitlin Clark. Because her audience isn't settled. It's still forming, still choosing habits, still deciding where to watch, what to follow, and who to trust. By placing her at the center of their NBA coverage, NBC isn't just borrowing her popularity. They're attempting to capture her audience before someone else does. That's a long-term play. And it reveals something even bigger about how they view her future. NBC isn't treating Caitlin Clark like a temporary spike. They're treating her like a cornerstone. Someone whose presence can anchor programming, reshape demographics, and redefine who basketball coverage is actually for. And that's where this move starts to feel less like a guest appearance and more like a soft launch. A soft launch of Caitlin Clark as a full-fledged basketball media figure. Because once viewers tune in for her analysis and realize she's sharp, articulate, and confident, they don't just associate her with the WNBA anymore. They associate her with basketball. Period. And that distinction matters. Because the biggest stars in sports aren't just great players. They're cultural reference points. They show up everywhere: games, commercials, commentary, debate shows. Caitlin Clark is being positioned to join that tier while she's still at the very beginning of her professional career. That's almost unheard of. Most athletes wait until retirement to transition into media. They wait until their playing days are over, their bodies worn down, their relevance fading. Caitlin Clark is doing it in reverse. She's expanding her influence while her stock is still rising. And NBC understands the advantage of getting in early. If this works, and all signs suggest it will, they don't just gain a successful broadcast. They gain a relationship, a partnership with one of the most magnetic figures in sports. Which is why this move isn't just about February 1st. It's about what comes after. Because when you start mapping out the timing of her appearances, the picture becomes even clearer. The dates weren't random. The gaps weren't accidental. And the calendar tells a story NBC hasn't publicly acknowledged yet. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where this story takes its most strategic turn. At first glance, the schedule looks harmless. 2 appearances, 2 nights, spread out just enough to feel special. But when you line those dates up against the basketball calendar, the timing stops looking casual and starts looking deliberate. February 1st, March 29th. Those aren't just convenient Sundays. They sit at pressure points in the basketball ecosystem. Moments when attention spikes, narratives reset, and audiences are unusually receptive to new faces. February 1st lands right before the NBA All-Star break. That's the moment when the league slows down just enough for conversation to dominate. Fans aren't just watching games. They're debating legacies, trade decisions, playoff positioning. Pre-game shows matter more because viewers are hungry for context, not just highlights. By placing Caitlin Clark there, NBC ensures she enters the conversation at its most reflective point. She isn't reacting to chaos, she's helping frame it. And then there's March 29th. That date sits right before the WNBA season is supposed to ramp up, a time when Caitlin Clark would normally be transitioning back into league-focused coverage, when attention would typically shift away from her temporarily. Instead, NBC keeps her front and center. This does 2 things at once. It keeps Caitlin Clark visible during a traditional lull, and it keeps the Indiana Fever, the WNBA, and her brand alive in the broader basketball consciousness. That's not accidental cross-promotion. That's brand maintenance. NBC is making sure that Caitlin Clark doesn't disappear between story cycles. She stays present, familiar, relevant, even when she isn't on the court. And then there's the part no one wants to dwell on publicly. Uncertainty. The WNBA is navigating delicate labor discussions. Insiders have quietly acknowledged the possibility of delays, adjustments, or disruptions. Nothing confirmed. Nothing announced. But enough tension that smart organizations prepare for contingencies. NBC prepared. If games slow down, Caitlin Clark doesn't. If schedules shift, her visibility doesn't. If momentum stalls, her presence on national television fills the gap. That's leverage. Not just for NBC, but for Caitlin herself. Because visibility equals power in modern sports. And Caitlin Clark's visibility is being protected, reinforced, and expanded at every turn. This isn't just about keeping her in the public eye. It's about keeping her indispensable. The more fans see her breaking down NBA action, the harder it becomes to imagine basketball coverage without her voice. The more familiar she becomes, the more influence she accumulates. And influence changes negotiations. Influence changes opportunities. Influence changes who gets listened to when decisions are made. NBC understands that better than most. They aren't betting on a moment. They're investing in a trajectory. Which is why these dates feel less like appearances and more like checkpoints. Markers along a path that leads somewhere much bigger. And that path becomes impossible to ignore once you consider what could happen if circumstances shift even slightly. Because if Caitlin Clark's role expands beyond these 2 nights, the ripple effect would be massive. Not just for her, but for basketball media as a whole. And the possibility of that expansion isn't speculation pulled from thin air. It's a scenario that powerful people are already quietly preparing for. But the most explosive part of this entire story? It hasn't even been confirmed yet. It was teased. Casually. Almost jokingly. But it was enough to light the internet on fire. And it involves one simple image that could change everything. Caitlin Clark, holding a basketball on national television. There's a reason this part of the story never makes it into official announcements. No press release. No on-air discussion. No executive sitting down to explain it publicly. Because it's uncomfortable. Behind the scenes, everyone in basketball knows the situation is delicate. Labor negotiations are rarely smooth, and the WNBA is no exception. Nothing has been declared. Nothing has been finalized. But uncertainty hangs in the air. And uncertainty is the one thing major networks never ignore. They prepare. Quietly. NBC didn't schedule Caitlin Clark's NBA appearances in a vacuum. They did it knowing that flexibility might be needed. That narratives could shift. That contingencies aren't pessimism. They're smart business. And Caitlin Clark, whether intentionally or not, has become the perfect contingency plan. If the season starts on time, her NBA presence looks like a powerful crossover moment. A win for everyone. A celebration of the game growing in new directions. But if things slow down, if schedules stretch, if momentum stalls, her role doesn't shrink. It expands. Imagine Sunday nights where NBA fans tune in not just for the matchup, but for a familiar voice they've grown comfortable with. A voice that feels modern, confident, and relevant. A presence that doesn't rely on nostalgia or old rivalries to hold attention. That scenario isn't dramatic speculation. It's logical planning. And it puts Caitlin Clark in a position no WNBA player has ever occupied before, becoming a consistent, visible face of basketball media even when she isn't playing. That kind of exposure changes everything, because visibility shapes perception, and perception shapes power. The more often fans see Caitlin Clark discussing NBA offenses, defensive schemes, and late-game decisions, the more natural it feels. The more normal it becomes. The less anyone questions why she's there. And at a certain point, it stops feeling like a crossover. It starts feeling like ownership. But here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. This scenario doesn't just benefit Caitlin Clark. It benefits the WNBA too. By keeping its biggest star visible in NBA spaces, the league gains relevance without competing directly for airtime. The women's game stays part of the broader basketball conversation even during uncertain periods. And NBC sits at the center of that ecosystem, controlling the narrative, the platform, and the audience. That's leverage layered on top of leverage, which is why this move feels so carefully constructed. Nothing is promised. Nothing is stated outright. But everything is positioned. And when you combine that with Caitlin Clark's growing comfort in front of the camera, the possibility of an expanded role starts to feel less hypothetical. She isn't awkward on air. She isn't rehearsed. She doesn't sound like someone reading notes. She sounds like someone who's been preparing for this without realizing it. Which brings us to the detail that sent fans spiraling. A comment that seemed offhand. A tease that felt playful. And a visual that could flip this entire moment into something much bigger. Because when a producer casually mentions hoping Caitlin Clark will have a basketball in her hand on set, that's not just a prop. That's a signal. And once you understand what that signal might represent, the speculation stops sounding crazy. It starts sounding inevitable. It was one sentence. Not a headline. Not an announcement. Not even delivered with confidence. Just a casual comment from a producer that slipped through like it wasn't supposed to matter. They said they were hoping to have Caitlin Clark with a basketball in her hand on set. That was it. And yet, within minutes, basketball fans everywhere started connecting dots that NBC never confirmed, but also never denied. Because in modern sports media, nothing involving a global star, a major network, and Madison Square Garden is ever accidental. A basketball in her hand doesn't make sense for analysis alone. Not on a pregame set. Not with Hall of Famers sitting next to her. That's not how these shows usually work. Analysts talk. Clips roll. Graphics flash. You don't hand someone a ball unless you want the camera to stay on them. Which immediately raises the question. Why? The obvious theory spread fast. Nike. Because Nike has been unusually quiet. For someone with Caitlin Clark's cultural gravity, the silence around her signature shoe has been deafening. No flashy teasers. No countdown campaigns. No slow drip of leaks the way brands usually operate when they know the demand is massive. Just quiet. And Nike doesn't go quiet unless they're planning something loud. Now put the pieces together. Madison Square Garden. National television. NBC's NBA relaunch. Millions of viewers across multiple generations. And Caitlin Clark holding a basketball. That's not just a visual. That's a moment. If Nike wanted to redefine how women's signature shoes are introduced, if they wanted to blur the line between NBA and WNBA marketing, there is no bigger flex than unveiling it during an NBA broadcast, without warning, in the most famous arena in the world. Not during a women's game. Not during a press conference. Not in a commercial break people skip. But embedded inside the NBA itself. That would send a message no ad campaign ever could. It would say, this isn't a niche product. This isn't a separate lane. This is basketball. And that idea alone is what sent speculation into overdrive. Because fans aren't just reacting to the possibility of a shoe. They're reacting to what it represents. Validation. Integration. A shifting hierarchy. Caitlin Clark isn't just being marketed alongside the NBA. She's being marketed within it. And that changes the math. If that ball in her hand turns into a demonstration, shooting mechanics, range breakdowns, grip feel, footwork explanations, it instantly becomes viral. Clips circulate. Debates explode. The moment lives far beyond the broadcast. NBC knows this. Nike knows this. And Caitlin Clark knows how to command a camera without forcing it. But here's what makes this theory even more unsettling for traditionalists. Even if the shoe doesn't debut that night, the speculation alone already worked. It kept eyes glued. It fueled conversation. It elevated her appearance from interesting to unmissable. And that's the real power move. Because Caitlin Clark doesn't need the reveal to win. The possibility already does the work. Critics rush in at this point. They always do. They say she's too young. They say she hasn't earned this yet. They say the NBA spotlight should be protected. But those arguments collapse under scrutiny. Because Caitlin Clark didn't stumble into this moment. She's been training for it in plain sight. And once you revisit her media track record, the idea that she's unprepared stops making sense entirely. Every time a new figure rises too quickly, the same line appears. She hasn't paid her dues. She's too young for this role. She needs more experience. It sounds reasonable on the surface. Almost responsible. But in Caitlin Clark's case, it falls apart the moment you look at the full picture. Because experience isn't just measured in years. It's measured in comfort. And Caitlin Clark has been living in high-pressure environments long before this NBC moment ever existed. She didn't just play in front of cameras, she grew up with them. Every big game, every record chase, every viral moment came with scrutiny. Post-game questions. Analysis. Expectations. She learned early how to speak without over-explaining. How to answer without shrinking. How to maintain control of a narrative even when the spotlight is harsh. And when she stepped into media spaces before, she didn't look out of place. She looked natural. During alternate broadcasts, she didn't try to mimic traditional analysts. She didn't rely on buzzwords or cliches. She spoke like someone who understands why a play worked, not just that it did. She explained spacing, timing, decision-making, the small things casual viewers usually miss. And more importantly, she didn't sound like she was trying to prove anything. That's the biggest tell. People who are uncomfortable on camera overcompensate. They talk too much. They hedge. They defer. Caitlin Clark does none of that. She listens. She reacts. She adds value. That's rare, even among former players with decades of experience. Which is why the too young argument feels less like a concern and more like discomfort. Discomfort with how quickly she's mastering a space that others took years to enter. And it's not just her communication skills that translate. Her basketball mind aligns almost perfectly with the modern NBA. High-volume three-point shooting. Off-ball movement. Reading defenses before they shift. She doesn't analyze the game from memory. She analyzes it from instinct. That makes her commentary feel current. Alive. Relevant. When she breaks down a play, it sounds like someone who would make that decision on the court today, not someone recalling how it used to be done. That's exactly what younger viewers respond to. And NBC is chasing that response aggressively. Because the future audience doesn't want lectures. They want insight delivered with confidence and clarity. Caitlin Clark offers that naturally. Which brings us to the real reason this move feels unsettling to some corners of basketball media. It exposes stagnation. When a 22-year-old can walk into an NBA broadcast and immediately elevate the conversation, it forces uncomfortable comparisons. Why does this feel fresher? Why does this sound more engaging? Why does this connect faster? Those questions don't just threaten egos. They threaten systems. And Caitlin Clark isn't responsible for that tension. She's simply revealing it. But this story doesn't end with her proving she belongs. It ends with what her presence changes. Because once fans accept her voice as legitimate, the entire structure of basketball media starts to shift. And that shift is already underway. At a certain point, individual moments stop being about the individual. They become signals. Caitlin Clark sitting on an NBA broadcast desk isn't just a crossover. It's evidence that basketball media is changing faster than some people are willing to admit. For decades, the structure was predictable. Former players talked. Fans listened. Analysis followed the same rhythms, the same arguments, the same stories recycled with new graphics. That model worked when attention was captive. It doesn't work anymore. Today's audience doesn't want authority handed to them by default. They want authenticity. They want insight that feels earned in real time. They want voices that sound like they actually understand the modern game, not just remember it. Caitlin Clark fits that evolution perfectly. She represents a generation that doesn't separate basketball into boxes. NBA here, WNBA there, old era, new era. To her, it's all the same language, spacing, rhythm, decision-making, pressure. And that's exactly how younger fans see it too. They don't care where the insight comes from. They care whether it's good. NBC recognized that before most networks were ready to admit it. By putting Caitlin Clark on that set, they weren't just showcasing her. They were testing a new formula, one where relevance matters more than resume, and connection matters more than credentials. And once that door opens, it doesn't close. Because if this works, and early signs suggest it will, others will follow. Networks will start rethinking who they elevate, who they trust, who they put in front of the camera to represent the future of the sport. Caitlin Clark isn't replacing anyone today, but she's redefining what replacement could look like tomorrow. And that's why this moment feels bigger than one broadcast. It's a warning shot to stagnant media voices, a reminder that the audience is changing and the game is evolving with or without permission. The most powerful part? Caitlin Clark didn't force this shift. She simply stepped into it, which leaves one final question hanging in the air. If this is what she's doing at 22, what happens next? Because when you zoom out far enough, it becomes clear. This wasn't an experiment. It was an introduction. When history looks back on this moment, it won't be framed as a guest appearance. It'll be seen as a signal. Because nothing about this move was rushed, careless, or symbolic. Every detail, from the stage, to the timing, to the people sitting beside her, was intentional. NBC didn't bring Caitlin Clark into the NBA conversation to check a box. They brought her in because they believe she belongs there. And once that belief becomes visible, it spreads. Fans start listening differently. Media voices start adjusting. The old boundaries between leagues start feeling outdated. Caitlin Clark isn't waiting for permission. She's building something in real time, expanding her influence beyond the court, beyond one league, and into the broader identity of basketball itself. At 22, she's already doing what most athletes don't attempt until the spotlight fades. She's shaping the conversation. And whether this becomes a recurring role, a long-term media presence, or something even bigger, one thing is already clear. This wasn't the end of a chapter. It was the opening line of a new one. So now the real question isn't whether Caitlin Clark can outshine legends on a desk. It's whether the basketball world is ready for what happens when she doesn't leave it. If you want to stay ahead of these shifts, if you want real breakdowns of the power moves shaping basketball behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe right now. Stories like this don't stop here, and the next one might be even bigger. We'll see you in the next one.